Okay, so today we're looking at the ethics of care, and we're only spending one class session on it, which is kind of a shame, because it is a important moral theory, but we can only pack in so much during the semester. So we are looking at the Virginia Held article, Feminist Transformations of Moral Theory, and you notice that we're already using some different language. I'm talking about the ethics of care primarily as a moral theory, and then she is talking about feminist transformations of moral theory. And you might say, are these the same thing? They're not exactly the same thing. Feminist ethics and ethics of care overlap to a large extent, but they're not identical. But they're not completely detached from each other either. The ethics of care as we know it is a recent moral theory. It's not saying some things that are completely radically new. As a matter of fact, you might actually, as we're going through this, say, yeah, but didn't so-and-so talk about this? Didn't we cover this just 2 weeks ago, with another moral theorist? And that's true, but putting it all together in the same big batch is something new. Think about recipes, for example. You can do just about anything you want to a pizza, and it's still a pizza these days. People put all sorts of crazy things on it. But there's some dishes that, unless you put all the components together, they're not what they are. And so, think about chili, for example. You can have chili without meat, can't you? People take tofu and put that in there. I suppose you could have chili without beans, although, that's not much fun, probably. What do you absolutely have to have in chili for it to be chili? There's a couple things, right? Yeah. You have to have some sort of tomato thing in there. And you might cut it with water, wine, or bouillon, or beer, whatever you want, but it's got to be a tomato base. What else? Even more essential. It's not chili unless it's got this, yeah.
Chili powder?
Chili powder, yeah. And chili powder is a mix of a bunch of spices too, right? Ground chilies, a bit of cayenne, some cumin, some oregano, some salt, some pepper. And unless it has that in it, it's not a chili. It might be a goulash or something else. Anything else you have to have in chili? What else is not really chili? Imagine some of you like chili quite a bit. Probably connoisseurs of it. You have to have some sort of pepper in it. Either peppers or onions or something. Otherwise, what else have you got? You just got tomatoes, maybe some beans, and chili powder. That's kind of an adult thing. Well, think of the ethics of care like that. There's all these different themes that are incorporated into it. And if you took some of them out, it wouldn't be the ethics of care anymore. It would be something different. The biggest one is really this. Women's concerns and experiences. That's why the ethics of care is tied together with feminist ethics. Because talking about relationships as important, didn't we talk about that with Ross just 2 weeks ago? We did. And every time I ask you in class, what's a good for you, you guys bring up family and friends, so you bring up relationships. Emotions, we've talked about emotions. Sometimes Held talks as if nobody's ever recognized emotions before. We know that's not the case. Plato talked about the emotions. You're going to see Aristotle talking about them. McIntyre talked about them a bit. And granted, Bentham and Mill didn't talk about them very much. But real persons over abstract principles. Again, didn't we just talk about that with Ross? Wasn't that part of what you guys found so attractive about his moral theory as opposed to Kant when I asked you about it in class? Some of you brought that up. You said, yeah, I can relate to this. This actually has to do with real life, ordinary people, the kind of morality that we're used to. But this is really new. The focus on women's concerns and experiences and on specifically childbearing, mothering, nurturing, and support. So let's start out with feminist ethics, and then we'll move our way into the ethics of care. And there's a couple things I want to sort of put on the table. First of all, what does it mean to say that something is feminist? we've got a class almost, or at least this class session composed of women, and presumably some of you are feminists in some sense of the term, and you've heard about it or read about it in classes and magazines and TV shows, who knows what else. What does it mean to be a feminist? I mean, if somebody asks me, are you a feminist? I'm always a little suspicious of guys who call themselves feminists, in part because of my generation, where a lot of the guys who did that were just sort of like trying to get in good with women. Maybe that's not the case for guys in their 20s. And if you tell me feminist means this thing, then I might say, yeah, I can get behind that. I guess I'm a feminist. If you say it means this thing, then maybe I say, yeah, I can't go along with that. So what does it actually mean? What does it mean to you? You guys can answer too. But we have a whole class of women who presumably have some, ideas about this. And it's okay if you have different ideas about this too, because it's hard to pin down what feminist means. So what does it mean to you guys? Are you guys feminists? In some sense of the term? Would you be comfortable calling yourself a feminist? What do you think? Or is feminism something for those other women over there who are interested in these other things? Even if you're not a feminist, you have some ideas of what it means, right? Yeah.
When I hear the word, I kind of think of like women's rights and like standing up for equality.
Okay, so women's rights. And that by itself is already something that has changed in its meaning over time. So what do you think the sort of the beginning rights were that they were talking about? Think back to your history books. Yeah.
Like the main one is like the right to vote.
Yeah, the right to actually participate in political life, to choose who's going to be in charge. In France, the women didn't actually get the right to vote until the 1950s. When you think about, the French as being so much more advanced than us, women didn't get the right to vote until halfway through the century. So the right to vote, that's a big one. That's political rights. What are other important rights you can think of? Think about this classroom. Just 2 generations ago, you wouldn't have been called women students, they would have been calling you co-eds. Which is kind of a weird thing to say, isn't it? Why would they call you that? Well, because that would mean that Marist was a co-educational university, which was unusual. That was, something that was changing. The rights to an education. Any one of you can major in anything you want, right? Can anyone tell you not to, because you're a woman? If they do, you've got grounds for what? Lawsuit, right? Because those are certain rights. So rights to education. What are other women's rights that matter? We've got political rights, educational rights. Yeah.
Right to work.
The right to work in any field, right? So you can't be excluded from certain jobs or confined to nurse, teacher. What was the third one that for a long time women were? Secretary. Very good. Thanks. Yeah, you can't be confined to those fields. As a matter of fact, there's more women in college and university right now than there are men. And unemployment is higher for men than it is for women. In part because of choice of profession. In part too because more women finish college than men do. And that's important for your job success. What about payment? Should you get paid less? Because you're a woman? Would that even occur to you these days? I mean, that was a big issue, wasn't it, though? Just 2 generations ago, even a generation ago. Interestingly, I don't know about the stats for your generation. For my generation, the wage gap is actually shifted the other way, so women make slightly more than men. But in the previous generations, there's a big difference. Women make less than men sometimes for doing the same job. So you've got all these 4 different areas. Any other important areas of rights you can think of? No? Yeah.
Anything in like the area like contraception, abortion?
Yeah, they often talk about these as reproductive rights because these have to do with human reproduction. And for a long time, women were sort of pushed out of the educational, the political, all these spheres, and just into the home, and regarded as, you know, just there to cook, clean, and reproduce. Having control over reproductive rights helps to break that a bit. So feminism is about those, about getting rights, or protecting rights? Would you guys agree with that, or? No? Is it about anything else? Is there anything more to the meaning of feminism? Yeah.
When I think of feminism, I think of like an extreme, like it's very like, they think women are like better than men. I mean, I don't think that's what it is by definition, but I feel like a lot of people associate feminism with a very extreme way of looking at.
Well, you know, there's a distinction that gets made sometimes between equality feminism and gender feminism. And there's a lot of other ways in which people make this distinction. And I think what you're talking about there fits under what they call gender feminism, where on the one hand there's this sense of historical injustice, and they want to turn the tables, and you know, men have always been oppressing women, men by nature oppress women. You know, you've all heard this sort of shtick before, right? Women should be in charge of everything. Everything is always better when women are in charge. And then there's equality feminism, to focus on, you know, equal rights, equal treatment, equal opportunities, that sort of thing. And these seem to be quite different from each other. And I don't want, like myself, I can get behind the equal rights thing, because to me that actually seems, if I'm a good Platonist or I'm a good Aristotelian, and women are equal to men in important ways, they should be equal to men in other important ways, right? I can't myself get behind the gender feminism, in part because I'd be an idiot to do so, wouldn't I? But I think even if I was a woman, I'd have a hard time with that. And I guess probably some of you do, too. Does that sound about right? Nobody wants to lock all the men up because they're all rapists, oppressors. Well, you know, so there's this whole spectrum, right? Feminist ethics can mean a lot of different things. One of the things that I think is important to keep in mind as you're reading this Virginia Held article, when was it written? You guys, any of you look at the date on it? It was before most of you were born. Yeah.
It's 1990.
Yeah, very good. 1990. So an entire generation ago. So that was written as I was just entering college myself, as a freshman. Do you think that any of the stuff that she's saying might have gotten a bit dated by then? You know, feminist ethics is supposed to be based on women's concerns and experiences. So let me ask you, because you're all you know, in this generation of currently 20-year-olds or 21-year-olds, 22-year-olds, do you think you have the same experiences as women did in the previous generation or the generation before that? Like your grandparents' generation, my parents' generation. No? Some of the same experiences though, right? What's the same, do you think? How many of you see yourself eventually down the line having a long-term partner or being married, maybe raising children, that sort of thing? That was pretty similar to back then, right? raising children is more or less the same as it used to be, except, you know, everything's made out of nicer materials, and there's a lot more daycare centers. What's changed from, say, your mother's or your grandmother's generations? How is your experience different than theirs? Yeah.
I think our generation's getting married later and having children later, and women are focusing on having jobs as opposed to having children first.
Yeah, I think you're right about that. I wonder how much of that has to do with how bad the economy is too. You know, I mean, I wouldn't want to be entering the workplace right about now. It was tough enough for my generation. It's going to be tougher for yours, unfortunately. Because the previous generations haven't done a very good job of keeping things going well for you. Different ethical issue there. Any other ways that it's different? So waiting a little bit longer to get involved in these activities that human beings have been doing since the beginning of time. Yeah.
I just think we have so many more opportunities. I mean, we can get internships, we can go to any college or university that we want, or we don't have to.
Yeah.
Nothing's really expected of us.
That's interesting to say. Nothing is expected of you. Do you guys?
To a certain extent.
Yeah. Nothing is expected of you as women, per se.
Yeah, not like, this is what you're going to do. You're going to have kids by the time you're 25, and be married and settle down. It's kind of open-ended.
So if you don't have kids by the time you're 25, you're not going to feel bad. Whereas, say, your grandmother might have felt some pressure that way. I think you're right. It makes a lot of sense. So when we're reading through this piece, women's concerns and experiences, that's something that's going to be changing over time and in society. There are certain constants, though, that you can think of. Some of you are in the fashion field, right? What's women's fashion like compared to men's fashion? Would you say it changes a lot more? Imposes more burdens on women?
Lately, I've always been probably saying that,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, I mean, if you get women's magazines, everything changes once a year, completely. You know, one year everything should be orange, the next year everything should be pastels, and you know, the lengths of things change. I bought this jacket back in 1991. I can wear this, provided I don't gain too much weight. I can wear this the rest of my life. Unless we go through the 70s again and men's fashion, you know, suddenly changes a lot. Now, you know, there's certain places I can't go and be seen as hip if I wear something like this. But those are pretty, you know, relatively rare. But what about women's fashion? You know, women's fashion, there's a lot more demands, aren't there? And it's been that way for a long time. And that's one area that hasn't changed. And that might be an area of concern or experience. Maybe that's something people would, you know, be interested in. That would be more, I think, about feminist ethics and less about ethics of care. So that's a long introduction. Let's look now at what is the ethics of care. So Virginia held, she starts out with this central question. Can moral theory, the sort of stuff that we've been studying this semester, can that just take into account these things without changing? So for example, relationships as goods. A lot of you have brought this up over the course of the semester. You know, when I would ask you, what do you consider to be good things? What gives your life meaning? You would say things like my friendships or my family. Or, and I think as some of you get older, you'll say things like my children, my home life. Can that be made part of ethics without really changing an awful lot? Probably, right? Because we have talked about that in our class. Could we talk, you know, for instance, about content parenting? You know, is it all right for a parent to make their child go to the college that they went to because they had such a great time there and they want their child to continue their legacy? Or would that be a problem from Kant's view? They'd be kind of using the child, wouldn't it? not treating them as an end. But that wouldn't actually change an awful lot. If you make a relationship into a good, can we think about that from a Kantian perspective or utilitarian perspective or even an egoist perspective? Probably. Certainly a virtue ethics perspective. What about the emotions? Can we say that the emotions ought to be involved in reasoning? Well, there it gets a little trickier. If you're Kant, absolutely not, right? Remember we talked about this? If you're Kant, you don't want those emotions and desires getting in there and skewing your reasoning and making you think you're doing the right thing when you're actually not doing the right thing. Or if you're Bentham, right? We're all kind of self-centered. If we're utilitarians, we've got to get away from that being self-centered and start looking at things very rationally. But, does everybody have to be down on emotions? I think you'll find virtue ethics. Some of the emotions have to be kind of repressed, but not all of them do. Some of them are valuable. Real persons over abstract principles. Again, didn't Ross incorporate that in his notion of duty? He was sort of bringing together Aristotle and Kant. Bless you. What about this stuff, though? Can this be taken into account without radically changing moral theory? Maybe not. Maybe that's the real sticking point. Women's concerns and experiences. Because if you look at the history of moral theory, Howell is right. It hasn't been done by women. Now, does that necessarily mean it's anti-woman or suppressing women or things like that? Not necessarily, but what's your experience when you get together with a bunch of people and decide, all right, let's say you're planning a party. What music should we listen to? And all of you like listening to a certain kind of music. Do you actually even propose, no, let's listen to this other stuff instead. We might get something out of this. No? Well, how discriminatory of you. You don't think of it that way, though, do you? If men have been making the moral theory throughout the ages, and a lot of these were men who didn't have an awful lot of involvement with women. Some of them were confirmed bachelors. They got out of the house and that was it. Or some of them lived in a society where gender roles were very distinct. Plato and Aristotle lived in Athens. And I don't know how much you know about ancient Athens, but men were in the marketplace and the polis, and women were in the home. And Athens was probably the most separate society that way. Sparta was not quite so much that way. Sparta had its own problems. If you've got that sort of situation, are men going to take seriously women's concerns and experiences? Probably not. Wouldn't you have the same problem if you're thinking about different cultures, or races, or classes, or anything like that? Probably, right? Or think about you guys as young people. Every 4 years, they make a great appeal to you, get out and vote. This election, you might be the deciding factor. And in the last election, it turned out young people actually mattered quite a bit. They put Obama over the top in a lot of places. Do you think that the older people and the politicians really know much about you or care much about your perspective, or are just hankering to make things work for you? Do you feel that way? No? You feel the opposite way? Yeah. This is a pretty endemic thing. This is kind of a constant thing. So Howell is pointing out that if we're going to change moral theory, to try to make it more inclusive, to try to take into account things that have been left out, and make it a better moral theory as a result, that's probably going to take some big changes. That's going to take what she calls a radical transformation. And I think part of the reason why you, as a generation, don't feel in the same place as your parents, grandparents, great-grandparents is because some of those changes have already been made. So she's proposing some things that have already been done. But if you look at the field of philosophy, I don't know if any of you have ever looked into being philosophers. Right now, in the United States, it's only about 17% women involved in philosophy. Now, a lot of the women who are actually doing philosophy are not in philosophy departments. They're in women's studies departments or English departments or history departments or political science departments. But the field itself is still largely male-dominated. Helen talks about a couple different things that would have to change. The first thing she talks about is emotions. And she talks about moral theory quite often as opposing reason and emotion. So you come into an ethics class and you learn about utilitarianism and you learn about deontology, and when you're going to apply them, somebody says to you, put your feelings aside. This has nothing to do with you. You need to think about things abstractly, take yourself out of the situation. If you're a utilitarian, you don't count your pleasure, your desires as worth any more than anybody else's. Or if you're a Kantian, don't trust your desires and feelings. Yeah.
Isn't there some utilitarianism where you like put down desires and then anything else for life and get something else?
That would be egoism. If you're a utilitarian, part of what makes you a utilitarian is you get past the purely egoist perspective, where your own desires actually do matter more than other people's because they're your desires, and you sort of put them on the same level as everyone else's. Now, that doesn't necessarily have to exclude other people's feelings. I mean, if I'm a utilitarian and I think pretty deeply about this, then I could say, well, her feelings are just as important as his feelings, as my feelings, as your feelings. But utilitarians don't usually talk like that. Instead, they talk about abstract principles. Well, what about our emotions? Let me put it to you like this. When you are thinking about right and wrong, do you feel anything? When you're thinking about situations, concrete situations where you've seen somebody do the right thing or do the wrong thing, do you feel affected emotionally? When you watch a movie and you see somebody do a generous action, or you see somebody sacrifice himself for another person, or you're watching a movie and you see the bad guy, say, abusing a dog, beating it, kicking it, that sort of stuff. Do you feel an emotion? Do you think those emotions are in some way a good guide to whether things are right or wrong? I see a lot of nodding heads. Why do you think that they're a good guide? I mean, Kant and Bentham would say they're not. Yeah.
Because like emotions are something that to a certain extent we can't control. Like,
Okay.
in terms of like stoicism, you can choose like not to hear, you can choose to like kind of suppress it almost.
Yeah.
But many times whatever we're feeling is something that just comes up, like right, like it's not something like, oh, I'm gonna make myself angry or I'm gonna make myself sad right now. It's just kind of something that happens on its own.
Yeah.
So in that respect, it's kind of like a natural way of determining whether or not it's like right or wrong. I don't know.
Okay. Well, I think that's a good point. You're right. We have less control over whether we feel our emotions. They arise often spontaneously or in relation to a stimulus. We see somebody doing something wrong. We often feel angry, or what are other feelings we feel when we see somebody doing something wrong? What do you feel when you see somebody doing something wrong? You don't all feel angry all the time at home. What else do you feel? Sad? Yeah, a sense of sadness or grief. That's kind of interchangeable with anger sometimes, right? You go from being sad and then suddenly you realize how unjust this is and now you're angry. And then after you're done being angry, you feel sad again. Anything else that you feel when you see somebody doing something wrong to another person? Yeah.
Anxious?
Yeah, a sense of anxiety or fear, maybe because it could happen to you or it could happen to those who you care about or love. Yeah.
I also say like disappointment.
That's interesting.
That they're not doing the right thing.
Yeah, and especially the more connected you are to that person, If they're a friend of yours, if they're a family member, often you'll feel that sense of disappointment. In some cases, disgust, I think. See some people doing things wrong. Disgust is a normal human emotion. As a matter of fact, they have these like categories of facial features, or not features, of expressions, and you can recognize emotions across cultures. So you can look at an angry face in this culture over here, and it looks like an angry face. And you can tell surprise, you can tell disgust. There's a certain basic range of emotions. And are we always right with these? Do we always feel anger towards the right people in the right situations? No, but there are cases where you probably should feel angry. What about more positive emotions? Are there things that we can call moral emotions? Because they're good, they lead us to do good things, or to recognize the goodness of other people and situations. What do you feel when somebody does something good for you? Yeah, grateful. A sense of gratitude, that's an emotion. It's not just like Ross said, oh, we don't care if you feel the emotion, we're only really interested if you do the actions, right? But isn't it more important that somebody actually feels grateful and you can tell that they feel grateful? If somebody sends a thank you note to you, and it's very nicely penned, but you know they don't care one way or the other. Does that cut it for you? Does that make you feel like they're grateful? Probably not. What else do you feel when you, somebody does something good to you, or yeah?
This is going to sound weird, but like a sense of like warmth inside, like.
No, I think that makes sense. Yeah. It's not quite the same thing as happiness or joy, is it? It's kind of a sense of contentment. How else can I describe that?
Takes that like a step further. I feel like it like goes like above like happiness. Like it's like a different.
Okay. Can the rest of you relate to that? It's hard. It is hard to give it a name, though, isn't it? Mm-hmm. But you've experienced it. Admiration, sometimes you feel, for people that do good things. What about love? I mean, again, every time I ask you, what are the good things in life? You bring up your friends and your family, and presumably you feel some affection, some love towards them, right? Not just desire to get something from them, not just happy that they make you happy. You actually feel something towards them. You also care about them. You're concerned about them, I think, aren't you? Would we call that a moral emotion? What about when you see bad things happening to people who don't deserve them, or who are actually good people? Does that bother you? Does that give you a sense of pain? Aristotle calls that pity. That's what pity means, is feeling bothered by seeing somebody else's distress. Compassion, empathy, these are all the words that we use. Ethics of care says those are really important, those emotions, that they should not only be responses that we base our reasoning on, but they should actually go into our reasoning. So we shouldn't just be these cold, detached, utilitarian, or Kantian beings that know, here's the right thing, we're going to put it in this box. We should actually feel a certain way. That's part of what the ethics of care is putting forth. And they're saying that this has often been left out of moral theory. And maybe you, as you've been studying these things this semester, maybe you thought this was missing too. When we get to Aristotle, you're going to see it isn't actually missing in all cases, but it is missing in Kant, and it is missing in utilitarianism. What else? Relationships are key. What are the important relationships for you? Right now, as a early 20s college student, what helps anchor you and tell you who you are? Yeah. Friends? Yeah, I think that's probably very important for you at this age. Yeah.
Family.
Family, yeah. So what does family comprise? What does that include? How'd you get here, first off? Somebody had to, like, have at least one night together. Some parents, yeah. You have a mother and a father, at least biologically. You may have, depending on what kind of family you're in, blended family, you might have more than one mom or dad. You have a stepmom or stepdad. Or I actually have like I actually have two fathers, but I don't know who one of them is. I have a adoptive mother and a birth mother. My adopted mother is dead. This was my adopted father a long time ago. But I have, essentially two parents. And actually, in the household that I grew up in, uncles and aunts were about as close as parents. Cousins were about as close as brothers and sisters. We have this gigantic Lemrees family clan. We get together every year for about 3 days. So my first cousins are sort of like brothers and sisters in a lot of other people's families. And my more distant cousins are like other people's first cousins. It makes it a little bit claustrophobic sometimes for people that you bring into the family. They don't always like it. But that anchors me. That tells me who I am. The oldest memories I have are of being with not my mom and dad, but my cousins, and doing things with them. And I think for most of you, those relationships are very important as well. They tell you who you are. Even if you're at the stage right now where you're reacting against mom and dad, I'm never going to be like them. They're horrible. There's a lot more of that in you than you realize. And as you get older and you have your own kids, suddenly you'll find yourself repeating their behaviors, mannerisms, and lines of moral reasoning, right? And that's, from the standpoint of an ethics of care, that's not necessarily a bad thing. You would want to think, like let's say your parents were real jerks and abusive, you don't want to continue that. But what if they're not? What if they actually do produce that thing that we still haven't given a name to, the sense of global contentment maybe? What if they actively work to do that? Well, hopefully you'll do that with your kids, or with whoever else it is that you have, in a relationship with that. Friends. Relationships between friends have often been looked at in moral theory as getting in the way. If I'm a utilitarian, I'm supposed to look at my pleasure as being only worth as much as everybody else's, right? What if I'm friends with her? Aren't I going to have a natural tendency to value her pleasure and to try to avoid her pain more than somebody else's? That would make me no longer impartial, right? So maybe friendships aren't such a good thing from that perspective. Well, the ethics of care says that relationships are among the most important goods that exist. And relationships aren't just sort of a contractual connection between people. I give you something, you give me something. There are things that we find ourselves in, and we can't necessarily change the nature of the relationship or make it be just whatever we want. You all know that expression, you can pick your friends, but you can't pick your relatives. It's rather true, except maybe through marriage, I suppose. But there's also something good about that. Your mom and dad are always going to be your mom and dad, aren't they? You probably have screwed up at certain points in your life, and you were really anxious about whether they would, respect you, love you, that sort of thing. And then, hopefully if they were good parents, they came to you and they said, I really don't like what you did, but I still love you. You're still my son, my daughter, How does that make you feel? You regard that as a good? That may actually have allowed you to become the person that you are today, being given that kind of support. So the ethics of care says that's really central. Relationships are not just reducible to what the people are getting out of them. They're something within which people find themselves. And for the ethics of care, one of the most important relationships that's been often downplayed or left out is the relationship between mother and child. Because if you're only focused on what happens out in the marketplace or in the political life or in the library or in the university, and there aren't a lot of women there at that time, then women's concerns and experiences, like the relationship between mother and child, which is absolutely critical for the development of a person, those get left out. They just get sort of assumed or taken for granted. But if you want to, psychology has taught us this. If you want to know something about why a person is the way they are, look at their parents. Look at how their relationship with them and their parents works. That's part of what made them who they are, what gave them the opportunities, the capacities that they have. Real persons over abstract principles. This is also part of the ethics of care. You often get the idea in an ethics class that we're not talking about real people. That we're talking about all these sort of general examples, all these principles that then somehow you'd have to figure out how to fit into your life. I think the kind of assignments that I give you hopefully help you to see how to connect these to your own life, like the journal assignments, for example. But it's still a lot of work, isn't it? The ethics of care says that what's really important are persons. Principles are you don't have to throw them away, but persons are what really matter. Your pleasure and pain, or your sense of self-worth, your development as a person. That's what really counts. And if principles help us understand that, that's great, but really what we have to focus on are the connections between us. Again, if you think about parenting relationships, especially the relationship between mother and child, that would fit in as well. Another thing that they talk about that I didn't put on the board, but it fits in with all of this, is how to understand the self and the person. And this is really central to ethics too, because who does good or bad things? Some abstract person out there that we use it as an example, Joe Blow, the Kantian. It's us, right? We do good and bad things. Greg Sadler does good and bad things. I've done many good things and many bad things in the course of my life. And they've made me who I am, and they've also made other people, for better or worse, who they are. Each one of you, I think, can say the same. Just not as many good or bad things at this point because you haven't lived, quite as long. But when you're my age, you'll be able to say that. Look back on that. Hopefully more good things than bad things. Well, certainly, hopefully more good things than I've done. So how should we understand the human self? What kind of model are we using? So each moral theory that we're studying has some sort of model of who the self is. You brought up Stoicism before. Remember with Stoicism, you were really your ruling principle, this reflective thing. And your emotions really weren't part of it, were they? They are kind of things that got in the way, that led you away from your genuine self. Even with Plato, I think, Plato had that three-part soul. The bottom part was your emotions and desires and things like that, except for the emotion of anger, which is sort of a higher point. But the best part of you was just reason. It didn't really have any emotions involved. Had some desires to be rational, but that was about it. Did Plato talk about your relationships with other people very much? Epictetus did a little bit, your roles, but there it's just a matter of doing the right thing, whether you feel like doing the right thing or not, right? So there are a lot of models of the self in traditional ethics that haven't really addressed some of these things. Another thing that Held points out is with the traditional concept of the self, we often look at it as, okay, here's my individual self over here, and I have my desires and my feelings and my relationships and my personal history, and then there's the universal self or society over here, and that's everybody. And And so either I satisfy my desires or take care of myself, or I'm taking care of everybody. So either I'm an egoist or I'm a utilitarian. Either I'm satisfying my desires and inclinations, or like Kant says, I'm following the dictates of duty, which are those things that everybody should do, right? Universalize. We talked about that. What about the middle stuff in here? It sounds almost like that's all you've got is a society and then the individual. And there's nothing in between. But is there something in between? There's something in between for you, isn't there? What's in between? Yeah.
People that you have relationships with.
Mm-hmm. Whole network of people, right? You've been introduced to some of the people that you have relationships with by other people that you had relationships with, who maybe now you've actually forgotten. So you've got this entire mesh or network of very contingent relationships that didn't have to happen. You know, the one guy that I'm still best friends with from high school, actually one of the few people I kept in touch with before Facebook came about from high school, I would have never predicted that we would have been friends. And I met him through another friend who then later died. And yeah, I mean, you can't predict this sort of stuff, can you? So you have these networks of friends. Who else? What else is in between? The universal society and you as an atomistic individual, totally on your own, no connections to anything else. What about your family? Your whole family life? Maybe you didn't think of that because you're friends with your family. But family and friends are distinct, aren't they? They overlap to some degree, but they're not exactly the same. And can you just do whatever you want? Like, you know, this atomistic, totally egoist individual. Can you do anything you like, anytime you want to, if you want to maintain this network of relationships, the in-between stuff? What happens when you try that? Have any of you ever tried that? Say, screw all these people, I'm going to do whatever I want to. Yeah.
Well, all your emotions are like linked to the people you have relationships with. So if you go off of what you want to do, you're going to end up feeling bad or sad or...
Yeah, you may actually make them feel bad too.
Yeah.
Screw you, I don't want to go fishing. I hate fishing. You're stupid. You know, somebody who likes fishing. They're not going to like that. And then they're not going to ask you to go fishing anymore. And they may not ask you to do anything else. Yeah, you're right. If you behave in an egoistic way and you don't recognize the goodness of relationships, the importance of maintaining relationships, then you will end up an isolated individual. You won't be a happy person. And you can't just reduce all those relationships to abstract rules of fairness or justice or things like that either, can you? You have to treat each individual as an individual, as connected to you in that relationship, as if their emotions, not just their rationality, but their emotions matter. Especially if you're dealing with children, too, who are very emotional. And they don't have their reason fully developed yet. She also talks about concern and sympathy. When you feel concern and sympathy, do you feel concern and sympathy for humanity in general? Do any of you feel that way? Oh, woe is humanity. The whole world is suffering. Is that how you feel concern or sympathy? How do you feel concern or sympathy? What is it like? Yeah.
It's more for like one person or like for a group of people.
Yeah.
Not necessarily a global group of people, but like someone.
Somebody or some group that you can point to, right? They're real. They have particular qualities. They have a history, a narrative. Yeah, you're right. When we feel concern for each other, we feel concern for each other if we're actually feeling concern as persons, not just as stand-ins for some sort of principle. So I think back to when we were talking about Kant and this, kingdom of ends. That would be very different from this, wouldn't it? If I'm looking at you in a Kantian way, I'm not really looking at you, I mean, you use the word person, but I'm not really looking at you so much as a real person, age such and such, my student here in this Marist class with his or her own background and strengths and weaknesses and feelings about things. All of that would be kind of put to the side from a Kantian perspective. What would matter is the fact that you're free and you're capable of choosing your own ends. That's not very much, is it? That's not you. You're not the Kantian subject, are you? If you are, then we should talk after class because I'd like to know a few things more about the Kantian subject. But you're not, and neither am I. We're real people, and when we feel concern or sympathy or care, when we care, we're doing it towards particular real people within the matrix of relationships. So if you have to sum up the ethics of care very briefly, one of the things that you could say is it values relationships as central. And it says that good relationships are to be fostered, are to be preserved, are to be chosen as a good over other goods. And their relationships are goods in that they are intrinsic goods themselves. They're also instrumental goods because in order for a person to develop, they have to develop in relationships. Even if it comes down to education. I mean, how many of you have learned more under a professor who connected with you and cared about you as an individual? You went to their office hours and you talked with them. How many of you have gotten much more out of those sorts of environments than out of the big lecture hall where, they don't seem to care at all? Yeah.
I mean, I know that I have, a lot of my education classes, it's like the same group of people and like the same group of teachers. And so, we're all kind of in the same departments and we see each other a lot. So I know that has helped me.
Yeah, that actually, that brings up another good point too. When you're together with other students and you're in the same class after class, or if you're on a team together, or like band, for example, you're able to develop those personal relationships as well. And we do know that students who study together and talk together learn more. They acquire more of the good of education. So relationships are not something that get in the way, according to the ethics of care, of other goods. They're actually what make other goods more possible. Now, does that mean that every relationship is automatically good? That would be one of the dangers of this, wouldn't it? I mean, are abusive relationships, or is the ethics of care going to say, stay in the abusive relationship? After all, it's a relationship. We know that a relationship is good. What do you think? Why would ethics of care say you shouldn't stay in an abusive relationship? What makes an abusive relationship a bad relationship? I mean, some people like getting yelled at and beaten and things like that. They're masochists. But presumably we think there's something wrong with that, don't we? What is wrong with that? Yeah.
You're talking about making your own feminist ethics if it's a woman
Yeah.
and she's being beaten, even verbally, then it's going to her rights as a person to be treated in that way.
Yeah, there's a lot of relationships where there's domination taking place or exploitation taking place. And that would violate somebody's rights. And that is important. You would also treat them as less of a person. That's another way of talking about violating somebody's rights. And it wouldn't allow them to develop as a person, would it? Did you have your hand up?
I was just going to say that in those kinds of relationships, one person treated as much as a person, as a real human person,
Yeah,
as they should be, and so that they're being treated more as an abstract thing rather than a person themselves.
yeah, there's something just there to satisfy the desires of the other person. And that wouldn't be, in a way, that's sort of like the opposite of a relationship, isn't it? We call it a relationship, but abusive relationships are really sort of the shadow or the flip side of a real relationship in which people can develop. One other thing I want to hit on too before we end, the same thing can be said about emotions. And we talked about this a little bit before. The ethics of care values relationships. It also says that we ought to cultivate certain attitudes or certain emotions towards other people. That doesn't mean that that emotion by itself is automatically good, so I get to be as angry as I like to all the time and say, I'm an ethics of care person. That would really go against the idea of the ethics of care. Nor does it mean that I can just allow myself to sink into depression and cry all day long. Even though there are a lot of things you could be sad about in the world, right? There are going to be certain bounds on emotion, and what's going to allow you to determine those criteria? Again, it'll be in terms of the growth of the people involved, whether the emotions sustain or destroy relationships. Can anger destroy relationships? Can anger also strengthen a relationship? Can you think of any cases where that might happen? I'll tell you about a case, and then you can see whether you can think of anything like this in your history. I've ticked people off in the past, when I was around your age and all the way through my 20s. People who I'm now good friends with, including my mentor. I remember him kicking me out of his office one time and yelling at me because I was, being a jerk. And somebody willing to actually, I was really smart, so I was kind of a smart ass, right? I knew a lot of things that I bring into conversations. And he could tell I was just kind of showing off. And I wasn't doing real philosophy. And that ticked him off. Because, he was a guy with a whole slew of kids. He was working on a degree of his own. He was teaching philosophy classes, responsible for all this stuff. Also a deacon in a church. And so really he didn't have time for some, 26, 27-year-old kid to be spouting nonsense, trying to, make a big splash for himself. So he told me off and kicked me out of his office. That made a big impression on me. What made the impression on me wasn't the act so much, it was that he was angry with me. And I think disappointed too, to use another emotion that we talked about before. And I felt so bothered by that I realized, and it didn't make a huge difference right at that time, but I realized I needed to change my personality to not be such a jerk. Well, that strengthened our relationship. There had to be a strong relationship there to begin with. Otherwise, I would have said, forget him. I'll find somebody else to be my mentor or something along those lines. But the fact that we had a relationship allowed that anger, right anger too. He was entirely in the right. If you had seen the situation, you would see that. To produce a better effect for me and to lead to a stronger relationship. So anger can sometimes bring about better relationships. The emotions that the ethics of care is going to be most focused on are going to be sympathy, sense of solidarity with other people, especially the most vulnerable, and that attitude that we call care. But the other emotions come into it as well. So let me ask you, since we have just a few minutes left, what do you think of this idea as a moral theory? You like it? Dislike it? Seem like something you'd want to pick up or something you find troubling? Yeah.
Well, I think it's interesting because I think it does touch on a lot of things that other theories that we study haven't necessarily, and it's taking into account a lot of it's very applicable to a lot of people. Like, I think a lot of people can relate to it or use it. I guess.
Okay. Well, what do you guys think? Can you guys relate to it? Or do you have stuff that you could take from this class session and use, do you think? To help you make better moral decisions? Do you think just being told that some of these things matter would enable you to make better moral decisions? Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I feel like this theory is very like self-explanatory. It's like human nature that relationships are good and your emotions should matter, but in this class we haven't been told that that's what matters, so now it's like, oh, that does matter. I think it's kind of weird that they do have the like woman concerns in it. Just
Yeah.
like a random little, like I don't see why it has to be so specific, but.
Well, historically, again, this might be the generational difference. Historically, it took feminists saying, hey, this stuff matters, for most male philosophers to take that stuff seriously. I don't know why that is, because myself, I look at this and I'm like, yeah, that sort of, how did you put it, self-explanatory, it sort of follows from itself. And I'm not, you know, I could be a feminist, I suppose, under some definition, but I don't think of myself as one. And I see these as, I think the way you do, as, yeah, of course, relationships matter. But yeah, it took women like pushing really hard and saying these things like mothering are important, to say a relationship counts. I'm not sure why that should necessarily be the case. I guess it's just because we're so easily caught up in our own perspective. You know. What do the rest of you do? Is this helpful? Was a class session a waste of time? That could be a legitimate answer. Not everything takes. Well, is this useful for you? Yeah.
I feel like all that stuff that we know that it's important to us and that's what's natural, but sometimes we forget that those are really the things that matter. So it's kind of, this moral theory, I feel like reminds you that those are the things that matter and to pay more attention to them and respect them.
Okay. I think that makes good sense. I forget exactly how it was phrased. This guy Wittgenstein, 20th century philosopher, said that philosophy is largely about reminding us of things we already know. Something more along those lines. I don't remember his exact formulation. So maybe this is something like that. Do you think this could have an impact on somebody who doesn't realize that relationships are important? Are there people out there who just don't get that? They're out of touch with their emotions. They can't stand other people's emotions. All right, we'll leave off there.